All right.
Okay.
Nice.
So yeah, so welcome everyone. I just as director of the Digital Curation Institute, I'm really happy to see you all. And I just want to reintroduce and give the word back to our DCI fellow. I'm just very, very pleased, especially that this is the first time I can reintroduce her as Dr. Victoria Palacin. So congratulations belatedly again for that. And this was only a question of time, of course, but it's really, really great that this is happening. Um, so yeah, so Vicky's fellowship centers around the design of pseudo-participation and the role of digital curation in the wild. And I've really enjoyed the previous DCI talks that she's hosted, and I'm delighted that we're able to welcome Sam McDonald and Pablo Aragon for this discussion here. So thank you very much, Victoria, for putting this together. And I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Christoph. So yeah, in order, I think to continue with this, I will kind of like explain you all what's going to be the structure of the event. So first, Sam and Pablo are going to introduce themselves, and they are going to tell us a little bit more about their work. And after that, I have prepared a set of questions that I am going to to ask. Feel free to write your more questions in the chat and to participate as well. So, having said that, maybe I will now give the floor to Pablo and Sam so that they can introduce themselves best. I don't know, would you like to start, Sam?
Sure. Hi,
Perfect.
everybody. It's nice to see everyone here. I'm Sam McDonald. I am a PhD candidate at the University of California, Irvine, hopefully graduating in a few months. And for the past 3 years, I've been studying digital democracy in the context of the United States Congress. So working on and off the Hill in DC, understanding how they use technology to communicate with constituents and how to design technology that's more deliberative in a way to bring citizens closer to the policymaking process. And my dissertation looks at one case study, an experiment that I did with a member of Congress to sort of bring more people into their decision-making processes. So that's sort of my expertise. Pablo?
Okay, so first, thank you, Vicky, and thank you all for inviting me here to this session. I find it very, very exciting. So I'm Pablo Aragón. I'm a research scientist and adjunct professor at Universidad Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, where I did my PhD on characterizing online participation in civic technologies. And I've been involved in research projects over the last 10 years. Initially working with grassroots movements and how they use social media for collective action, and then gradually transition to the role of participation technologies at a city level, but then at different scopes for participatory democracy, with a focus on how the way technology is designed and the way the technology is deployed. It might be seen technical, but it has very strong social and political implications. So as a data scientist, how to get from data some insights of collective behavior within these platforms.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Sam. And I am really excited to have you both in here because I think Pablo's experience very heavily talks into like open democracy, and Sam's experience with how the government of the US is using technology is like very relevant. But my first question to you today is going to be a meta question, and it's going to be mainly related with like what is the ultimate goal of participation in your opinion, and what do you think is the goal of like digital participation in a society?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, when you're asking specifically about what is the goal of participation, that one's a little bit hard for me because I always come from the side of participation is not always the end goal when it comes to engagement, but efficacy. And you can have 1,000 people participate, but if they're not having impact at the end of the day, then sometimes it can feel a little bit unjustified to do so and illegitimate in a way. So when I think about participation and the goal of it, it really is about getting to that efficacy point. And how do we design technology in particular for systems that actually engage in real impact scenarios, and not just what we've seen in a lot of civic graveyards of people talking online and maybe having some engagement, but not understanding how to get that direct line to the policymakers or to the systems of power where these decisions are being made.
Okay, so thank you, Samuel. For me, this is about transformation. So when we're talking about platforms for political participation, no matter that we're thinking about data platforms, but also the existing channels, existing possibility that we have to get into politics, the real motivation is to transform societies, like to improve the way our societies are organized, to improve the resources and how they're distributed among the community members. So for me, that's the ultimate goal, like how to transform all our societies. And technologies can bring very interesting features that maybe past channels or past methods for doing politics were limited, and new limitations will appear as well. But for me, it's everything about power and transformation.
Absolutely, and I also would like to add in there that something that like often gets overlooked in terms of participation is that participation is actually one of the fundamental elements in like our sustainable development agenda. So I am right now doing some work for the UN, and whenever we talk about e-participation, we think about it in terms of sustainable development, because we do believe that like it's part of like the way that participation transforms society, as you said, and it can support very positive transformations if it's being employed in a way in which like engages people and lets their voices being heard. So yeah, that's a very interesting point. And so I am going to like try to dig a little bit more into like technology and politics in this section. And my next question is mainly going to be related with uh, are technologies democratic? Are technologies political? And why and how do you think so?
Yeah, I definitely, I mean, if you're going back to like the theories of Langdon Winder, I mean, all technologies have politics in some way, but if you're talking about big P politics, absolutely. I mean, here in California, every time we have an election cycle, we have referendums where citizens are able to vote directly on certain policies. And this year we had 3 really major ones related to technology and democracy that really exemplify this, where we had the votes on whether or not Uber drivers should be considered employees or contractors, which is a great example of when direct democracy fails, in my opinion. We also had GDPR regulations that were coming to California that were voted on, and also whether or not California should be able to use algorithms in their justice system to help judges make decisions for who goes to jail or who has bail and things like that. So absolutely, these connections to how we use technology and how it portrays certain systems of democracy are definitely tied together, especially in these big P politics scenarios.
Okay, so I will build a bit on some say that I totally support, like, or going to much more in the root, like in the end, I think the question was what makes technology political. I think like tech is made by humans. So we as humans are political animals. So obviously like every technology that we are building is incorporating or political perspective or political thoughts or political biases. So in the end, there are like many decisions about the relations of powers within technologies between participants that are strongly political. And for sure, if we think about political technologies, we can, like civic tech is something that will come to our mind very easily. Also social media in terms of the role that it's playing in democracy, it's important. But I think other experiences that are also technical, like Wikipedia, is strongly political because it has a conception that the knowledge has to be free. And I think this is a strongly political goal and commitment. And in the end, like, while thinking about technologies, I think we're talking about digital technology. So most digital technologies are based on the internet, which in the end is also a very political construction because it cannot be understood without the politics that were ruled during the past century. So I think every tech is political in some way, as is built by people who are political as well. So the second question was more related to democratic, I think, what makes technology democratic. So I think this is much more complex because normally there used to be a confusion, at least it's a confusion from my point of view, between participation and democracy. So technology or a platform that allows participation does not guarantee that democracy is happening there. Like more participation does not imply more democracy. Actually, even like dictatorial systems have a lot of means for allow participation, but we will not consider that participation is democratic. I think like a technology that is democratic is a technology that is considered participation not only on a way that we as users can use that platform, that technology for taking some action, but also that we have like a full governance of the platform itself and a full governance of the design of the platform. I think this is what democratic technology should be around.
Yeah, and I want to hop on to that for a second too, because I absolutely agree that what makes technologies democratic depends, but it also depends on which democracy that you're talking about, because I think sometimes we have this big label of like technologies democratizing, but we have direct democracy and representative democracy. And even within representative, there's parliamentary systems, or there's systems like in the US with two-party systems, which have very, very different agendas and very different power structures. So even when we say something is democratizing, there's still a lot of complexity that really needs to be digged into in terms of what does this actually mean within the context, which I think sometimes gets a little bit skewed when you see all these civic texts come out for democracy, but it doesn't explain really which one and how is this coming to be.
Absolutely, and I think this links quite well with a point a while ago Kostis raised, which was like we have this tacit assumption that participation is supposed to be there for like a democratic society, which is not necessarily like a right assumption, because you have different like systems of participation, different systems of governance, and in a way or another, assuming that participation is going to be the mean to construct that may not be right. And so okay, so technology is political because in a way or another it mediates power, right? And I wanted to hop a little bit more on like the topic of power and talking a little bit about like the power dynamics that exist in decision making. Many of these platforms, well, what they do is that they allow people to engage in decision making processes, particularly open democracy platforms. Well, they're not called open democracy, I guess, but they are platforms that mediate participation. And however, these platforms often tend to have issues when it comes to balancing what people want versus what the experts need and what the experts consider to be an appropriate solution. And I have seen this happening, for example, in participatory budgeting, where there are certain stages that are designed so that the decision makers and the experts can, of course, use their knowledge to the best. However, this can often feel like this can feel like the voices of the citizens are not being taken into account, or well, people can feel that their voices are not taken into account because although they may vote for or against something, another decision may be made. What are your thoughts on this topic, on like how do we reach that balance of power between like the voices of people and the expert knowledge?
I can go. So for me personally, I mean, this is where I'm really, I do a lot of studies on representative democracy because I do believe that there is a space for representatives to kind of bring space between citizen and public sphere discussions and expertise and kind of put them together. And it is a really hard balance to have between the experts. There's a famous quote from a random member of Congress that says, I want my scientists to be on tap, but not on top, because having this expertise is great, but we know for that there's a lot of examples where expertise can conflict with the needs or the values of the people, and there needs to be that mediation to figure out what's a good balance. And it really depends on the topic and the scenario, and where do we want citizens to lie? Like, for example, we want experts on climate scientists to tell us exactly what we need to do, but oftentimes climate scientists may want to do things that can take away from the people's voice, and getting rid of all the oil industry jobs in the US would be amazing, but we have to make sure that we have people have other jobs too, and how to balance that usually takes a lot of negotiations where the expertise has to be balanced with like the citizen input as well. So absolutely, there needs to be this careful balance between expertise and citizenship. And I think actually that's where representation really flourishes, when it can be done correctly, although we're not seeing some great examples of that, of where you have this kind of centralized place for this deliberative system to work.
So I have a similar opinion to what Sam expressed, so I will try to also bring some complementary ideas. Like, I think that when we are thinking about like the role, this trade-off between expertise and a participatory approach through the citizenry, let's assume that decisions are finally taken by citizenship. Okay, this is not often the case, but we can assume that. Still, I think it's much more complex than just having the power to take that final decision. I think that if we go to, and Sam mentioned before that there are many different kinds of democracy. If we go to deliberative democracy and we go to the experiences of citizen assemblies, there is a lot of empirical evidence on how experts might affect the deliberative process, like how expertise is introduced, like how this information is provided to participants, even that the participants have the full power to take the decision. This can extraordinarily bias their decision. So I think this is some, there are many evidence on that way. So this is something quite relevant. So what makes me think about it is like, since experts will influence in some way or the other the participation, I think it's important to think about who are the experts and in which way like expertise are really covering like all the needs and sensitivities of a society, and whether like vulnerable communities, marginalized voices are part of that expertise, or they are just can only participate through the citizenship side, and obviously they're going to be affected by the mainstream discourse and somehow. So I think this is some real complex problem that as a researcher, I only know the question, but I don't know the answer.
Yeah, and I guess it's a question that, like, you know, it's quite deep, because I think it goes back to questioning what knowledge is, and what our society right now considers knowledge to be, and like what is the role of like local knowledge, and for example, knowing like your surroundings, knowing your areas, knowing how things go in your own environment. I see that somebody was asking if there is an established path for invigorating these models over a more extended period of time. And the only thing that came to my mind was also something I wanted to bring up, which was an example from Switzerland. So in Switzerland, they do have a direct democracy. And what that means is that they have over a year, I think it's considered a democratic innovation. They have these referendums, and these referendums that have turned quite surprising in other places of the world. In Switzerland, they actually help regulators, because they have about 1 or 2 every month, and people has become used to participate every month in like the decision making in their own parliament, which is, I think, a very interesting example of a path. I have not seen if that example has been adapted to other democratic systems, but it would be very interesting. Yes, Matthew, you can unmute yourself and share your thoughts with us.
Hi, yeah, that was my question there on integrating the system, everyone. And what you mentioned about the Swedish model, I think of information, it might speak to a cultural kind of, like I was saying, collective base of knowledge that these kind of things need to be engaged with and not New York and LA, but these kind of public governance.
I'm not sure we can hear you, Matthew.
Oh no.
We're having some issue with your microphone.
Oh, okay. You can't hear me at all.
Now we can hear you better.
Oh,
but
okay. So I just want to say that it may be a cultural difference between the Americas and just an established pattern of understanding and engaging with governance in a healthy manner, as opposed to a self-interested commercial manner that we see more in the Americas. Because many people have told me, especially in New York, that this is America as a company is a country that's very much oriented toward the companies and corporations and collective rather than the local of it, despite espousing right that everybody says. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree. I think that there are definitely different culture, and also like the political systems themselves. The affordance of the political system definitely changes that. I don't know if Pablo or Sam have any thoughts on that.
Oh, just wanted to quickly say, that's not to say it can't be changed, though. I'm always ever hopeful like that. There's definitely an established way to change culture and shape it in a desired manner.
I don't know what I was thinking, like, since I was bringing that idea about expertise in narrative practices, to try to provide some answer, not only questions. I think it was published in last year in 2020, this report by the OECD about it's called Catching the Deliberative Wave, and they have reviewed like different democratic innovation in terms of deliberative practices, and some of them they include experts. Many of them, they bring experts. So a proper review of that could bring some possibilities of how to bring that expertise. But also, since Vicky, you are familiar and you have worked during your doctoral research with citizen science, I see many citizen science projects are good examples of how to not only engage, but also empower citizens in a research project which has like a clear societal or environmental impact. And by doing so, they need to get in contact with different experts. And there are some approaches that are, I think one is called like radical citizen science, or like the Bristol approach, that they've been doing like different ways of bringing the expertise in part of this participated research process. So I think those are examples that we can bring in the field of democracy.
Absolutely. I think there are like really good examples, and the field of citizen science has definitely like evolved a lot, and it has had this evolution of like how power has flown, and right now there are a lot more participatory models that definitely would inspire like other types of interventions. And speaking of like new approaches that are emerging, I'd like to take a minute to talk a little bit about like open democracy and innovations that relate to like open democracy, and perhaps Pablo, you could share us a little bit more about like the experience that you have with Decidim, and what was the role of Decidim in the countries it has been deployed so far.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that. So I didn't mention, like, I'm part of the member of I'm a member of the team and also a member of the board of Decidim. It's a platform for citizen for participatory democracy in cities and institutions around the world. So it's a project that started in Barcelona in 2016 by creating a platform for one specific, originally for one specific process in Barcelona, and then it evolved to create a platform that could fit for different purposes, not only for the city of Barcelona, but in any others, by creating like a flexible architecture of spaces, like for assemblies, for temporal processes, individual spaces, and then how to be able to populate those spaces with different features that are typical of participatory democracy, like budgeting, proposals, initiatives, debates, and so on. And it's a project that have succeeded in terms of, well, in different dimensions, but one of them is like it has been adopted by many other institutions. So the platform now, the code, since it's open source and it's free, it's being used by the European Commission, by other cities like Helsinki, New York City. It's being used by governments, France, Italy. So I think that it's very interesting because it's opening a way of how to create a standard at the technological level of how to run these participatory processes. And this has many values, like, well, it allows to scale participation, because technologies, they allow us to, like, millions of people to participate asynchronously, and also it helps in some aspect for the facilitation and in the documentation automatically by using technology. But also in terms of open democracy, it contributes a lot in terms of accountability, in terms like, since all the proposals that are being written, all the events that people are attending are being documented properly in the platform, then it helps to provide models for accountability to review whether the decisions that they were taking are being implemented or not, and where the origin, the full path of the participatory process. That is something that sometimes in the offline setting is much harder to account for it.
And can we like take a step back perhaps and talk a little bit more about like what is open democracy, and what are like good examples of like open democracy that we can already see emerging around?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've seen a lot of different examples of how like the phrase open democracy is being used, but essentially especially platforms like Decidim and stuff like that are great examples of when you are providing platforms for inclusivity and open information and accountability in these ways, where you can bring together people to have these sort of discussions in a way that's transparent to the public. And that's mostly how I've seen it be used. I mean, it's even when you look at how people use the phrase open democracy. Sometimes people are focusing on transparency when it comes to having governments bring more information, transparency, or if you see open democracy being used in the sense of like open deliberation, so having things being open for debate. So it's used in a lot of different contexts, I believe, as well, at least how I've seen it.
Do you think that the civic tech communities belong to this open democracy, well, over like this larger concept?
Well, like from my perspective, like a large fraction of the civic tech community came from the open data movement somehow. So there is like this idea of openness is embedded into their practices. And if going to your question, like what is open? So like, in terms of democracy, I can imagine like open, when the term of open democracy was coined, it was based on the assumption that democracy was closed. So if democracy was closed, it should be related to the presence of elites that are taking most of the decisions. So when we are looking about open democracy, we are looking for experiences, initiatives that are allowing ordinary citizens to take full control of the process. Now, if we think about the citizen participation ladder by Ernstein, it's like we are transitioning from a citizen tokenist into a real citizen control. So what are good examples of open democracy? For me, a great example, and I'm not talking about technology, I'm talking about a practice, is participatory budgeting. Like I think this is a perfect example because it has the full flow, like the identification of problems, the proposal of solutions, the internal and social negotiation between where the funds, the budget should be allocated, and finally the decision making and monitoring of the progress. So I think participatory budgeting is a perfect example, and it's something that, for instance, when it was born in Brazil, it was part of a huge effort in logistics rather than the technological approaches that we know now, and that brings some other value. But I think participatory budgeting is, for me, like the ideal of open democracy.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I mean, there's like semi-open examples, right? Like the Canadian and Irish citizens assemblies in a way. Those are some good examples of bringing people and then bringing things up to referendum. I don't know as much information, but I know Taiwan's been great experimenting with technology-enabled forms of open democracy in terms of bringing more people into the systems. So we're starting to slowly see these things grow out to different countries and experiment in different ways and utilizing them for different questions. Like Pablo said, participatory budgeting is a great example in Ireland, using them to ask like big questions like the abortion question and things like that. So it also is just being used in very different contexts as well, which I think has been really interesting to see when governments choose to integrate them in terms of what questions do they think is even up for political or for public debate and for public inclusion.
Absolutely. And I see that Konstantinos had a question, and I don't know if you'd like to share it with us.
Well, Konstantinos is me, actually. It's Kostis, right? Okay. Hi. Hi, Victoria, again. Anyway, I mean, I don't want to go back to this question, but really, I mean, because the conversation has moved on, I think, and it's moved on to interesting things in my mind. I mean, so yeah, I agree very, very much, and it resonates with me that what's important is that citizens and people are involved through technology in the decisions that are most closely affect our lives, right? So very much this neighborhood context, in the context in which you're involved at the municipal level, at the level of making decisions about direct decisions that have to do with you, like your budgets that go into stuff that really affects you directly, is important. However, when we're talking about democracy, and this is what the question that I want to sort of bring back to the panel is, okay, we're talking about the big decisions as well. I mean, this is the week in which the Polish government enforced a law that really prohibits abortion almost completely, right? And citizens just walked out in the streets because that's one way to react to something that affects a nation, right? So I was wondering, what are the ways in which we can think about technologies, digital technologies of communication, in which we can mobilize in a way that affects a society globally, and the big decisions, and those decisions as well. Not to demean the importance of the decisions that are close to us, right? Because I'm also a supporter of the notion of going to the grassroots and thinking from the ground up. But I think we need to think about these broader decisions. We've seen a total disaster in the United States in the last few years because of who was sitting on the top, right? So I'm just posing this question back. How can we affect the big game, you know, the center table effectively?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I know I recently went to Ethan Zuckerman's talk about his new book coming out that really points to this in terms of doing civic participation when it comes to these more direct democracy, deciding on small municipal bills or things like that is only one form of participation in this broader civic sphere in terms of protesting being a healthy way to do it and trying to get to these bigger coalitions, because individuals, assuming that a citizen as one individual should have an impact on their own, when oftentimes these collective action problems are really important. And social movement theory tells us that we need these big coalitions to make these big impacts. You can't just do it on individual civic participation alone. There's a reason why social movements and these big organizations become so important to these more global and radical understandings. So I totally agree. And if we're gonna get to these bigger pictures, I mean, my expertise is only on the US, and we have failed in a lot of ways. And fundamentally, the only reason, the main reason that I've always thought about this is because of this lack of representation. I mean, we have 535 members of Congress right now when really we should have like 1,200. And for some reason, we just stopped adding representatives in the 1940s, when really we need to have this more diversified representation in a way where we don't. And that's where I think a lot of, at least in the US context, a lot of the failure has been on lack of representation and a lack of these more larger coalitions of people being able to come in and influence government in a way where it's become completely polarized.
That is so interesting to hear from you, Sam. Also, that brings or makes me think about the role, for example, of technology like AI. AI right now has been like promised as like the one motor that is going to make decision making more efficient. And one of the reasons why it's being promoted like that is because it can like reduce the costs on representation. And I do have to agree with you. I do think that reduction would probably lead only to more problems. But however, it's something that many governments are looking into because it's a promise of well, saving resources, which always sounds good.
Yeah, I think that what we were discussing, and this was a great question, is not only related to tech and how tech can solve it, but it's how we have designed our institutions. So I think when we're thinking about local institutions, they have been defined, and the different bodies that are composing at a local level that very well attached to the specific local problems and the specific communities, and the distance is very close. And actually, you can attend the meetings of the local government very easily in many places and be part of it. Well, it's quite hard to imagine a country that citizens can participate and join the deliberation of the group of ministers, or even a regional level is like the way that we have defined national, regional, and local governments. The abstraction has grown, and that level of abstraction has also been, I think, is related to the different mechanisms that as citizens we can access to make some change. So it's much easier as a community to make an impact at a local level rather than a regional and of course a national level, because there are not official mechanisms in this institution that allow so many ways to participate. So technology often, to make a change, they have to be somehow related to these channels for making an impact. But if those channels, they do not exist in the institutions, tech cannot replace that. So I think it's important that if we want tech to change our institutions, like this deployment of tech has to be also complemented by opening new channels to participate and trying to think like different ways of democracy. That, as some say, there are many of them, and it's relevant to have different paths for having initiatives, for having citizen debates, for having more open budgets, for like having an hybrid model with different mechanisms and at different level in which we can do some interventions in our community on those different scales. And for doing so, tech will provide us like a lot of features for being much more efficient in the way that we self-organize.
And well, thank you very much, Pablo and Sam, for your thoughts on these topics. I would like that we move to the next topic, and the next topic centers around political polarization and its effects on well, democracies, especially because political polarization has been greatly facilitated by technology. And I wanted to hear a little bit of your thoughts on like how polarization, or well, political polarization in society has affected digital democracies and democracies.
Okay, so I disagree with what you have said. So finally, I can disagree in the panel. I was looking for it because you have said that polarization has been promoted by technology, and I think this is not. I don't support that. I think polarization has been enhanced by specific designs of technology. So I think that when we start to design technology for personalized or own fits on a specific interests that are reinforced by a recommender system, that what they are looking for is for trying to increase some specific kind of behavior that often is related to more consumption of those feeds and more clicks on those feeds because they are related to the economy of the internet that has been built, like doing click brings money because of the ads system. So we need to recommend things that are going to optimize that kind of behavior. This is not tech, this is tech design, and this is strongly political. So I think that is the reason why when we are seeing like major outlets like Twitter and mostly Facebook, they have been promoting that kind of behavior and people getting isolated in filter bubbles and not exposed to other point of views because of that. While we can see other designs like Wikipedia, like for any topic, there is only one article and people from different point of views, they have to meet there and negotiate and deliberate whether they edit the content following some policies and some principles like the neutral point of view and so on. So I think polarization is the result of design, not the result of tech.
Yeah, I have to absolutely agree with that. I mean, when you look at all the examples out there of where polarization is mainly coming from, I mean, we've always had in some ways a need for healthy disagreements, but when you get to these points where it gets so catastrophic, you really have to point to where the methods in which this is where this is occurring. That's especially happening in how we're designing technology. And the phrase "developing technology to manipulate human behavior" sounds bad, but we're gonna do it too if we're gonna design systems for more engagement. And there is this sort of shift in terms of how we design for human behavior and shift towards things. We're still nudging people in certain directions. It just depends on which way you're going to nudge them. And at this point, when we're talking about the root of this polarization problem, it really is, I agree with Pablo, in the design of these systems that we're building.
Absolutely. And I think we're entering like, well, Matti and I have been, Martina Limarca is a colleague with whom we discuss a lot of these topics, and we've been calling these like digital ideologies. And I think we're entering that territory definitely because in a way, technology design and interfaces have become windows to the ideologies of the developers, and they become the kind of like the tool through which those like very physical and very clear tool through which those ideologies are kind of like made reality. And that's, I think, a very interesting point. And my next question on this topic, it relates a little bit more like on social media and the role that like, well, social media has had, a disruptor role in political systems, but also like quite a force, well, promoting polarization, promoting fake news, and I am wondering if there are like digital spaces that, for example, from like a democratic point of view, from the government, if those spaces have failed to allow people to let them express themselves, to let them express themselves, basically. If those spaces have failed, and have those spaces in a way caused that people has been going to social media to kind of like go and express themselves more heavily, and as a result kind of like polarize.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. You mean
I'm
like
sorry, yeah, sorry, I got a bit lost in
it's
the
like spaces promoted by governments that they were a failure and people moved to social media to keep the discussion?
No.
Is it
Yeah, no, I'm what I'm meaning is that like there are like certain discussions, particularly discussions that have that are related with political polarization, and I am wondering if the spaces like created by the government, if those systems basically they have not met the needs that people has, like to deliberate and to discuss in a healthy way these topics, so that people has had to do those in other platforms. And I wonder if that's a dream, if that is even possible.
I mean, I think it's pointed to two different things here. So for like polarization, I mean, one of the main drivers of polarization is monetization, right? Because the more polarized and the more that you can put people into certain boxes, the more money that you can make off of putting them into certain boxes. So monetization is a huge part of that problem that really drives these design choices towards polarization in a way. So that's really important. So when we're moving to more government systems, that monetization system is not going to be the same inherently, but that doesn't mean it can't over these design choices. I mean, you see governments all the time be like, oh, wait, we want it to look like Facebook. We want it to look like Twitter, because there's a lot of discussion going on here. And if we're moving things through these sort of sessions, we need to find a way to inform governments in terms of like what hasn't worked on these platforms and why these specific design choices are polarizing. And if we are going to move to systems that are better, then we need to sort of move away from these structures and think about, okay, well, what do you need for government itself? And like, what are the drivers and how do we design systems that are opposite? And I think oftentimes when you see these tensions going on, it's because governments come in and they want to build something like what they see in social media onto their own government systems in a way that they're not thinking about their own needs or just thinking about these broader designs that have always been attractive, but are designed to attract us in a certain way. So I think those are important questions for there.
Absolutely. And I think this relates a lot with, in the previous DCI talk, we had Orestes, and Orestes was telling us, well, some of his research around like how people use a certain like forum platforms and how he has found the moderation behavior to change depending on the topic, on like what options, for example, they allow and like the up voting or down voting, whether they enable it or not. And I think it's very interesting because indeed it resembles like the social media features that already exist, but like they also kind of like get modified. And I have also seen that type of behavior. I think was it in participatory budgeting, we were studying a little bit of the decidim cases, and there were like some reports on like how people would use the only feature they had available, which was the voting feature, at certain stage of the decision making, and they could just take their votes back and then move them all to the proposals that passed to the next phase, so that they could like drive the proposals in some way. So it was very interesting to see that people had figured that feature made sense, and therefore the system administrators were not able to really say like how voting has really changed or not, or what has been its relevance, because people has been like doing that. And that's I find that very, very interesting.
Yeah. Well, something I was thinking now is like, I think there are many reasons why these platforms from governments can fail. And one of them is like, we're seeing like these major social media platforms that have like millions of people participating daily. Like these platforms, their interfaces, their features are the result of massive experimentation, and they are experimenting in real time, trying to maximize the kind of designs that promote that. So obviously, we cannot expect that an institution is going to create a platform from scratch with 4 developers that is going to compete with all this team of Silicon Valley companies with hundreds of behavioral scientists providing feedback. Well, that's from the beginning. So obviously, in terms of resources, it's ridiculous to expect that from institutions. So institutions, they have other kind of resources that are quite valuable that these other platforms cannot compete. And I always give the same example. So during my thesis, I was collaborating with the project Decide Madrid, which was like a system platform of the city in Barcelona for the city of Madrid. And when they started, the only space that they have, it was called Citizen Debates. So it was a space that you were able to open a thread and discuss it, and that was nice. But in the next week, it appeared another space called Citizen Proposal. So there you were able to create a proposal that if it reaches a minimum threshold of signatures, it went to a voting phase and finally has to be implemented. And proposals were also able to be discussed, as this debate that exists only for the first week alone. So what happened is, like, once the proposal existed, these debates, people stopped using them. They became marginal. Why? Well, because if you want to spend your time, you're not going to spend your time on a debate that goes nowhere. Because you have already your channel, you have your social media feed, you have your friends, you have, well, we used to have social spaces where we meet physically before COVID. I hope in a few months we will have them back. But it's ridiculous to try to replace these existing places without not providing any value. So in that case, what we will see, like, people start to use the debates of citizen proposals, because if these proposals get some final signatures, they were able to do some kind of transformation in the city. So that makes sense. So those debates became marginal. So the only time that those debates, they will reach some kind of peaks of activity in the next months was when the mayor of Madrid at that time, or local representatives, they have like some debates with participants, like Reddit style, like AMA. So in that case, they bring some kind of value. Like, you were able to talk to the mayor in a space that normally you cannot do in social media and others. So that gives some value. So I think those things are relevant. Like, if you want to create some kind of platform from a government or institutional level, you have to be aware that in terms of design deployment, you cannot compete with all the resources of the Silicon Valley companies. But there are some other benefits that you have an institution related mostly with decision making and with power and transformation, that if they are incorporated into the platform, maybe that might work.
Yeah, and I want to hop onto this real quick, because I think Pablo brings up a really important point of value, and this is something that might be slightly controversial, but I want to pull back at some civic technologists that kind of push this civic altruism in a way where citizens are supposed to be all knowledgeable and wanting to participate all the time, when we clearly know that many people have participation problems, and that even if you build these fantastic sites for people to engage, people often don't have time, they don't have the willingness to do so, they don't see the value in doing so. And I actually have approached people a few times and asked, like, why is basic things like, why is monetization and why is not paying people to come and work with governments frowned upon in a way? Because we have these expectations of people should be engaged and it should impact their communities in a way, but the value that you get from citizens is sometimes equivalent to paying someone in a way. So I wonder if there is a space in the future of thinking about value in these different ways, of not just people showing up and feeling good, they get these direct interactions with politicians, but showing them other sorts of values in a way that I think we haven't experimented enough with, or have not really talked about, like how important citizens should be as part of the process and bringing different types of value to that system.
Absolutely. And I observed that also during my research, that very often, at least in citizen science spaces, there was like this kind of like inner wish from researchers to like have everyone engaging fully from like beginning to end. But very often that lacks like kind of like the sense of reality, that people cannot really do that, because I mean, they also have a full-time job, they also have a life they have to keep up with. And I concluded that like different types of participation are valuable, and sometimes they are temporal, sometimes they are not. And very often actually participation is kind of like drawn as a ladder, or as a like there are like different levels, and where there is like the deep participation always on top, and that I think reflects like an inner thinking that that's the better participation, and therefore engaging lightly is not good participation. And I whereas I see that more like a parallel, or everything is like a pie, and all types of participation like are very important. So many of them can happen in parallel. You can like engage as a consumer in one, you can be completely driving a project in another aspect of your life. And definitely I also look forward to see like how those spaces, or well, those types of participation get embraced in future. I do think that they should be, if not retributed, like at least part of some larger, like, I don't know, structure. I don't know if maybe one day we're going to have this universal basic income with one of the terms that you need to get engaged.
Victoria, I mean, yeah,
Yes.
It's very, very engaging life. I have myself a lot of questions, but I was wondering in the few minutes that we've got left, if any of our participants have any questions that we want to ask, because it's very rich, so far.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think we should move that way. And So I think that Matthew, you have a question. Please raise your hands, unmute yourselves. Yes.
Okay, everybody.
Matthew, we are having issues hearing you.
Is my mic okay? Can everybody hear my mic? Sorry.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So I was thinking like what Pablo was saying that these government institutions have the resources to fully develop a robust design that is friendly for democracies and enables a healthy engagement with democracies. I was thinking that there should be like a non-government NGO, like an institution, to develop white papers for outlining common design faults and the effects that these design faults have in democracies, ideologies, and governance, and maybe developing like some frameworks, space frameworks for designs that can support healthy democracies that then can be built out for the specific of it. Like coming from an engineering point of view and having worked in the semiconductor industry, I feel like that robust like archive of these like base designs and documentation of the points of failure would be a benefit to internationally, actually, like, because it's very much like something that is very much international. But that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think I got your point. We have actually been discussing about that with Pablo, Sam, and Mati, and we are trying to work towards something like that. We call it like the patterns of participation, and we want to create a framework. We are still trying to find our way to truly map it. We have been mapping so far participatory budgeting platforms, but yeah, we are very open to ideas on how to improve that research. We're definitely interested in developing something like that.
Yeah, and I want to point that I think there's a lot of research coming out on where specifically public participation is failing, or where there's where there's these pain points happening. What we're also seeing is that there is a reluctance to get these institutions to change. And I think that's changing, especially recently with the onset of the pandemic and things going remote and wanting to try different types of engagement, which is really exciting. But I think there's a lot of push to the sea. We already know a lot of the problems going on, and that really the hardest part is going to be pushing these institutions to change and to try something new and experiment in a way that I think that we're slowly starting to see happen.
Absolutely. So I think we have a minute left, and I don't know if, well, we probably are going to stay some extra 5 minutes. I apologize for that, but you know, if you have something to go for, feel free to drop the call. But I wonder if anyone in the room has any question or thoughts that you'd like to share with us.
I have an issue. I'm in Massachusetts, and I'm trying to promote the idea of having public internet discussions involving members of public bodies, and that's seen as a violation of the open meeting law. The open meeting law is well intended. Its intention is to make deliberations of public bodies transparent, but in order, the way it's written, that means that the meetings have to be in-person meetings, and a discussion on the internet is seen as a violation, presumably because it could be happening in secret and the public couldn't see it. So if anybody has advice on how I can make the case that public internet discussions are in fact more open, not less open than in-person meetings, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you can look at the examples of Congress. I mean, like, we've always had a digital open commenting system when it comes to regulations in the federal government that has always been assumed to be more transparent, and because they know people can't physically get there. So it's interesting to see the fact that they think the internet is closed, even though everyone's forced to be in these open environments. Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like there's starting to be countless examples, especially in the federal level, of where it is providing transparency in a way, and there are ways to make it completely open and accessible. So it's an interesting argument that they're making, and I don't know where their basis comes from, or if they have evidence to support that in a way.
And the argument is made that it disenfranchises people who don't have internet access, but these days, basically everybody has internet access. So I find little merit in saying that, you know, some significant number of people are disenfranchised.
Well, in person often disenfranchises people, and there's evidence of that. Especially, my representative Katie Porter talks about how stay-at-home moms can never attend her town halls because they're 6 p.m. on a Friday when she used to take care of her kids. So they've always been, in a way, inaccessible to a certain population. So it's interesting that they're saying that, because it's oftentimes more inaccessible in person.
That is indeed an argument I've made in response. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add in that direction, like when we're talking about, because when we're talking about tech for public issues and this kind of internet spaces, like digital divide is always one of the main topics that emerge, and we have been in this debate many times already. But I think it's important to emphasize some aspect. Like, of course, like internet access is not longer a major barrier, but there were other barriers or divides that existed before in presential spaces, like what the one that Sam says, like the participatory divide is another. Like there are some people who are even professionals of participation, and you can see them in every council, in every meeting, and so on, no matter whether it's digital or not. But I think like the real challenge here is not a matter of access, it's a matter of skills. So even that we all have access to the internet, access to the tech, we do not have the same level of skills and same literacy to how to get profit of that technology for your individual and collective interest. And I think that is something relevant. So typically there are some communities that are they have much better skill towards these digital abilities, and they know how to get more profit than the others. So I think an important part of it is not focusing so much on the access, because it's starting to be very well granted, even that we are still surprised that the access is not so high as we can perceive, but it's about the inequality of skills and how we can address that challenge through literacy.
Absolutely, and well, I can like add as a last point that I think that's a very interesting point and also very important, and I see that also being raised by like institutions like the UN and the World Bank, looking like into data literacy issues, into issues of like digital access and equitability of like digital services that goes beyond only like having open data open, or like a website app that relate to the skills, to the resources, etc. And I do think that that's going to be a very interesting topic for future research. But well, so like I will have to stop this conversation right here so that we can we can like stick to the schedule. It has been super interesting, and I'm pretty sure we could like stay talking for a very long time about the topic. And I wanted to thank everyone for joining today this talk. And I don't know if there are like some last words that you'd like to share with us, Pablo, Sam, Christoph.
Oh, no, I'm just happy to be here and have these discussions. It's always great to talk about these things and really get people involved in thinking hard about how we're going to change our civic infrastructures, because it's a tidal wave of civic tech that's coming, and it's great to have people thinking deeply about it.
Yeah, same here. It's a pity that because of COVID we cannot be there. Like otherwise we go now for having some beers and continue the discussion and even become more controversial, like beer after beer. But this is our current situation. So the only thing I can say is like, thank you very much. I really enjoy this panel, and I hope that we keep in touch, because I see that we have many common concerns, and I would like to continue the discussion in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, everyone. Those that wish to stay, we're going to probably stay a few minutes just to like say some words. But yeah, thank you, everyone.